back to the workshop. I'm Bill. Today, I've got a Model 5101 lantern here. This was made in the Toronto factory. These were undated, but would have been made in the very late 50s or early 60s, so roughly about 1960. These are not really uncommon, but they're not the easiest things to find. They're kind of neat looking. The frame on them, or the burner, is essentially the same as the Model 200. They've got these neat aluminum vents, which this was a little beat up. I've straightened it out some. They can be very abused because of the soft metal. But these are unique. You'll notice it's got a propane type number on it, or a model number with 4 digits as opposed to the usual 3. But these don't run on a standard propane canister like you see today. And this is the reason why there aren't many of these around anymore. These, and this is what we're going to look at later, and see how difficult that is to come off. And it's actually supposed to go up and then rotate, but it doesn't. These ran on these LP canisters. I don't think they've made these since probably the mid-80s at the latest. Maybe they made them into around 1990 or so. These have long since been discontinued, so unless you've got a way to refill these or can find some new old stock, or purchase an adapter to run on a standard propane canister, there's not much you can do with these, but they are kind of neat oddities for collectors, I guess. What I'd like to do with this, and the reason I've got it here today, is, and I've been asked to do some videos on painting and that kind of thing, so I'm going to see how this goes. I'm not sure how it's going to work out at this point. This has a steel 2-part, call it a fount. The canister simply goes inside and it sits in here. For the American versions, there's a little round door on the side that pulls out, and it's got a frame that holds the LP canister and it slides back in. On those it's nice because you can leave that out and plug in an adapter hose. These, I'm not really sure how that would work without modifying this. You'd have to drill a hole in the side or something to get that adapter hose out. So these really are pretty much useless as far as I can tell, unless you can find some old LP canisters. When I got this, it was in pretty rough shape. It's been hanging in a shed just a few blocks from here for decades. And in fact, it took quite a bit of work to get these two halves separated. At the time, didn't have time to mess around with rust removal or repainting it. So I simply took some sandpaper and I sanded the rust down on the inside lip here, and did some light sanding to get rid of the rust around here, but it's still fairly rough. I can just get it on. It's hard to get it back apart, and there's no way it'll rotate for these tabs to lock in. So this is our project today. I'm going to strip the paint off, and you'll get to see my electrolysis setup for that. I'm going to see if that'll take care of it. That'll get rid of the rust. If it doesn't, we may have to break out some paint stripper as well. But I'll see you back here, or actually see you at the electrolysis tank once we've got this taken apart and ready to go. So here are the two halves of our lantern fount, for lack of a better term, on this LP model. They've been in the electrolysis tank overnight. Sorry, it's a little bit cloudy. It normally is, but I kicked the tank a bit trying to get this set up and stirred up some of the debris. But you can see how the electrolysis tank is working. You can see it bubbling away there. That's been removing the rust overnight, and it should also be stripping the paint off pretty well. So I'm going to take this in the house and clean them up. Lift them out here so you get an idea. See how the paint is all blistered and bubbled up on the inside and the outside. So most of that should come off pretty nicely, and the rust can be cleaned off. Now, here we are with the two halves to our 5101 fount. Not really a fount, I don't know what else you'd call it, but it's been in the electrolysis tank. They've come out pretty well. It didn't take all the paint off the inside. I'm not too worried about what the inside looks like at this point, but it did take most of it off. My biggest concern, and if you're painting a standard lantern fount, this won't even be an issue. My biggest concern is the mating surface between these two halves. So the bottom half, the outside here, and on the upper half, the inside. It's got some rust on there. I actually did sand this when I first got it. It took some real work to get it apart. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, because even stripped, now I can actually turn it into those locking tabs now. I couldn't do that before, and it's much easier to get apart than it was. But this will be an interesting experiment to see what happens when this gets painted. I'm gonna guess I'm not gonna be able to prime the inside of this under the color coat. Coleman didn't prime these things, but if my paint gets too thick, this is gonna be a real bear to get apart. I'd be back to where I started. I'd almost be tempted just to put it together and paint the whole thing as it is. But we'll see what happens. It may improve once I've sanded this. This kind of gives you an idea of what you may find when you strip a fount. Brass founts are wonderful. You strip them, the brass doesn't rust. So it's just a matter of, take some fine sandpaper and wet sand it. You can see this has a few little specks of paint here and there on it. But the bottom came out pretty nicely, aside from some pitting around the bottom rim. And I'll see what I can do with that, but this will never be perfect in that regard. But interestingly enough, the top did not come out very smooth. It's got a lot of rust, or a roughness on here. So I'm going to take this through a number of sanding steps with different grits, and we'll see what we come up with. So I'm going to set this aside. This will be the easy one. Basically this, I just need to wet sand lightly and then do some work on the bottom. The top part's going to be the challenge, and of course something you won't have to worry about on a normal lantern fount, but just trying to get the inside of this smooth enough so that it goes back together, the two halves go back together, and even after it paints, that I can still get those two halves back together. So I'm going to try starting on this with some 150 grit, and we'll just see what happens. I'll go on the side with the light here so you can see. That actually seems to be getting the job done. Normally I'd wear gloves, but I want to be able to feel what I'm doing, and that is working surprisingly well. Even where the black spots are, I'm not feeling any pitting. So I'm going to keep working this over. I'm happy with how that's going. So I'm going to go ahead and continue off camera with some 150 grit on the rest of this just to smooth it out, and I'll come back when I'm done with that. All right, so here we are. I've sanded the whole thing with 150 grit. It's pretty smooth already, so we're just going to work up until we're wet sanding that. I don't want to go too smooth because I'd like to have something for the primer to grab onto, but I'm actually pretty impressed. Again, not something you'll deal with a normal lantern fount, but the two halves are actually getting pretty smooth here. Again, once I get paint on there, that's going to change that, so hopefully I've got enough room to play with. And I'm going to go ahead and prime the whole thing, but I'll probably have to sand most of the primer off on these mating surfaces and just let the green paint, or paint it with the top coat. But we'll see how that goes. I've never messed with that kind of thing before, so but you won't have to deal with that if you're doing a normal lantern fount. So I'm going to move from 150 grit to some 320. This is actually some fairly used 320, so it's not going to be super super gritty, but I think it'll get the job done here. And then from there, I'm going to move on to some wet sanding. All right, here we are. That's sanded with 150. It's feeling pretty good. This is still This is actually a little bit better. I need to have a little more, but I'm pretty happy with that, and we'll hope that it works all right once we get some paint on there. So now I'm going to step up to, this is 600 grit, and I'm going to wet sand this, and this is the most I'm going to do before I paint. After we painted, we primed it, I'll hit the primer with some 1000 or 1500 grit and wet sand that. So just take that and... All right, that feels really nice. I think we're ready for primer now. I can barely feel anything on the surface here. So I'm going to dry this off, and when I see you next, we'll be set up to hit this with some primer. All right, here we are ready for priming. This is what I'm using. It's this Rust-Oleum 2X primer. It does a pretty good job. Put it on in light coats, follow the instructions. Each paint's a little bit different, but I've got these cleaned off. I've wiped them down with a tack cloth and some mineral spirits, and then let it dry just to make sure there's no dust or oil from my hands on there. And we'll go ahead and start spraying. So I've already shaken this up, and I'm just going to, from a distance, do a light coat. One of my concerns on this is I don't want to overdo it on the lip. That's got to have some overlap. So I'm going to take it easy with the primer. Let's see how this looks after I've sanded. Now you won't have to worry too much about getting too thick of a primer coat on it. And I'm less concerned about this upper, because it doesn't have to overlap. Now, before I did this, I already sprayed the inside. You won't be worried about that for a standard lantern. Just need all right, I'm gonna let that sit and come back in a couple of minutes and at least do another coat on the bottom of this and all over on this. Try to get around the edge here, but I don't want to get too much primer where it's got to overlap. So I'll be back in a few minutes. I'm back for a second coat. I've inspected these, and that first coat is pretty thin. I can see it barely covered in some places, so that's fine. We'll hit it with a second coat, and I think this should take care of it. My sanding job does look pretty smooth, so I'm hopeful that this will come out with a nice finish when we get the color coat on there. Again, I don't want to overdo it on the lip where it's going to overlap. I think that's good. All right, welcome back. Normally this Rust-Oleum primer needs to cure for 24 hours, but thanks to the magic of the oven, it's just been about an hour. I baked it at 300 degrees for 45 minutes approximately, and it's good and cured now. Now, let me say, I didn't use the oven for real. Actually, I used my barbecue. If you use the oven in your kitchen, chances are your wife will be very unhappy with you. Ask me how I know. So I use my barbecue. Some people fire up their Coleman put their Coleman oven on it and bake it that way. I let it dry until it's dry to the touch, and then put it on a rack and set it on the grill. Just make sure that it's not directly over any flames, or see if there's a way. My grill has some diffusers in it, so there's no direct flame coming up underneath these. It probably won't hurt the primer much, but your color coat could end up burned. So what I'm going to do now is, this needs to be smoothed out a bit. So I'm going to wet sand, and I'm going to move up. The last thing we used was 600 grit. So I've got some 1500 grit here, and I think this should do the trick. If it doesn't, we'll go back down to 1000. Get that wet. And the main thing is we want to take any rough spots off without taking the paint itself off. So there you get the idea. That's really all we need to do. If you're still not satisfied with how it's smooth, you can keep sanding. I'm happy with this, and like I said, if the pits are really bad, just sand it smooth, sand it down close to bare metal or all the way to bare metal. Let that primer fill it, and then hit it with another coat. So I'm gonna see you back when we're ready to put some green paint on here. All right, we're ready for our color coat. You can see I've sanded where I'm going to have some overlap between the two halves. Again, you don't have to worry about that on a regular lantern fount. I've also already sprayed the insides. I'm using the color coat that goes with the Rust-Oleum primer. You can use whatever paint you want. One thing I've done, these pieces are slightly warm, and I've left my color coat sitting in a bowl of hot tap water just to warm it up a bit. It flows a little better that way, so you get a smoother coat. I've also put some nails down just to lift these up a little bit. You could suspend them on strings from the ceiling, so they're hanging, something like that. I don't like my things, if I don't need them to, I don't like what I'm painting spinning around in the air in front of me. It's just too difficult to paint. So I put some nails down just to get them off the paper a little bit so things don't stick. And also it helps me get that bottom edge just a little better. And again on this, I'm really trying to avoid getting a thick coat around that rim because it may stick and I may have difficulty getting the two pieces together and apart again. So, basically put on a light coat and come back every 5 to 10 minutes and spray another light coat until it looks good. Usually needs about 3. Lighting in here isn't real even. Here's a flashlight. And just inspect everything. And I think we look okay. So I'll come back in a few minutes to put a second coat on. All right, 10 minutes have passed. We'll go for a second coat here. Again, thin. enough to cover everything. Let's check it with our light. So, mission accomplished. Here we are. I've got it all back together. You can see the fount. I think it looks better than it did before. It's not a professional paint job, but you can get a pretty decent paint job out of a rattle can. I went with 2 coats of paint. I had planned on 3, but one of my concerns on this fount is getting these halves to fit together. After getting 2 coats of paint on there, I realized it was starting to build up, and I was afraid to go with any further. I could have done more on the top part, that wouldn't have mattered, but I was concerned that if the paint got any thicker, I wouldn't be able to get these 2 halves back together. They're still difficult to manipulate, to get back together, but it's better than it was when I got it, and I kind of suspect that even from the factory, this wasn't always the easiest connection to separate and then to put back together. So that's with 2 coats. If it were any other lantern fount, more than likely I would go with 3. You could clear coat it at this point if you wanted to protect it, or if you wanted to get it a little shinier. Depending on the clear coat you use, it's probably not going to make it any shinier unless you get into automotive clear coats. But you could wet sand this to get it even smoother and then spray some clear coat on there. But that's certainly going beyond what the factory did. This would be more or less what you'd get from the factory. Now, this is about painting lantern founts. I didn't say anything about vents. And this particular model, it's kind of a moot point because this is an unusual one with an aluminum vent. But what if your lantern has a vent that's not looking so hot? This is an old 327 or 427 vent. It's 70, 80 years old. It's losing some porcelain. It's pretty rough. Sometimes you'll find them even rougher than this. Can you repaint that? No, you can't. That's why this is called painting a lantern fount. You cannot repaint vents. This is not paint, it's porcelain. Porcelain will hold up to the heat, and even as you can see on some of these, sometimes the porcelain struggled to keep up with the heat, especially on some of the large singles in the kerosene models. You'll see the porcelain is often damaged. If you try to repaint this, especially if you're using just standard off-the-shelf spray paint, it will discolor and quickly burn off. You can use even the barbecue paint or the very high temperature paint will at least discolor if not burn off. There is some spray paint that's made for brake calipers that can handle very high heat, but it will not remain glossy. It will dull once you fire up the lantern and run it. So if you've got a bad vent, you kind of have to live with it. If you want to spend the money, there are places that you can send it to that will strip the porcelain off, and I'm assuming they'll prep the vent or the metal for you and will put a new coat of porcelain on, and they look beautiful when they're done. But that's really your only option with the vents. Don't try to paint it unless you're prepared to use something like brake caliper paint and realize that it's not going to look like it did originally, and you're also going to be limited by the color range of those paints. So, how to repaint a lantern fount. I know this is a bit of an unusual one, but I think you can see the process. It's all in the prep work, really. It's about stripping the paint, but then even when the paint's stripped off, you need to spend some time doing some sanding, removing the rust, and wet sanding and getting a nice smooth finish on the metal so that there's something for the paint to stick on, and priming it and then sanding the primer as well. So I hope this helps. We'll see you next time.